Welcome to the Why podcast from London Business School, where we look at research and what it means for you, business, and society. I'm your host, Katie Pisa. Today, we're asking, why do teams fall apart and what can we do about it? Most of us avoid conflict, but avoiding it can be costly. Studies show managers spend 20% of their time handling team conflict, yet few have a clear framework for diagnosing and dealing with it. To help us make sense of the chaos, I'm joined by Professor Randall S Peterson, whose decades of research reveal that not all team conflict is created equal, and neither are the solutions. Randall, welcome to the Why podcast.
Thank you, Katie. Great to be here.
If you could just outline some of your research on conflict and the four main areas of team conflict that you've addressed, and how did you come about doing this?
Okay, yes. I've been studying conflict for a long time, and the kind of orthodoxy in the research is there's task conflict, which is about the task we're working on, and then there's relationship conflict, the negative affect, I hate you kind of stuff. And we've been talking about that and how its relationship to various, outcomes in teams for 50 years. And the nutshell is, in a nutshell for us is really that relationship conflict is a result of what's happening in the team. So if the team is doing well, we can all get along okay. If the team is doing badly, we like to blame each other, which tends to escalate and result in, I don't like you. So most of the other stuff about how it relates, and that we'll be talking about today, is task-based. So when it's about the task itself. What we did a few years back is we were interested in where does conflict begin? The argument has always been, wherever it begins, ultimately everybody's going to be involved. And if you ask a group how much task conflict is there, they'll all report something similar. And increasingly in the research, we find that isn't true, that different people have very different reactions to how much task conflict is going on within a team. Why is that? And so we start with looking at the origins of conflict, and then we were going to track how it changes over time. And we identified 4 different origin points for conflict. We have the solo person. Maybe it could be somebody who has a very principled point of view, different from others, but it could also be the person who's just a bad apple, difficult to deal with.
The devil's advocate.
Yeah. Well, devil's advocate's a nice way of saying it, but sometimes people can just be
a difficult person.
Yeah. Then there's the dyadic one, which starts with 2 people having a debate, discussion, right?
And this is the most common one.
That is by far the most common.
I think you mentioned 35% of conflict.
In our research, at least 35%. And in some groups, upwards of, 40, 45%.
Okay.
Then you have the kind of half and half, down the middle conflict.
So 2 teams are opposing each other.
2 sub-teams.
Sub-teams within a team just can't make it work.
Right. And then the last one is everybody has a point of view and nobody agrees on anything. Right?
That sounds like the most complicated, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, it is the most complicated, but thankfully it's also extremely rare.
Okay.
Right. That was, in the single digits in the data we were looking at.
Okay.
So you're more likely to get any of the other 3.
Sure.
Dyadic being the most common, but the other 2 are also moderately, common in teams. And the big surprise for us and the big paper for us was showing that we tracked these teams over 20 weeks. And what we find is that where a conflict begins is ultimately where it ends. If there's 2 people having a debate within a team, we just assumed everybody would get involved. It turns out they don't. Everybody else is playing other roles, doing other things, not getting in on it.
And choosing not to for various reasons.
So that's the research we're doing now. If we have a little time, we can talk about some of that at the end about what we're looking at. What are they actually doing?
Right.
Right. But they're certainly choosing not to engage directly in that debate if there's a dyad having a debate.
Okay.
So what we thought was origin of conflict turned out to be structure of conflict. It stays in that same structure from origin right through to any kind of resolution.
Really interesting. And before we talk further about this, is this goes across the board, big companies, small companies? Is in your research, do you look at only companies with 1,500 employees, or is there a range of sizes and shapes?
Yeah, even in our original paper, we looked at undergraduates working over the 15 or 20 weeks, right? Teams of 4 or 5, right?
Okay.
And we got data from a bicycle manufacturer in China where their teams were anything from about 4 up to about 20.
Okay.
Right? Big, multinational kind of company, right? And we've looked at everything kind of in between. So it seems to be pretty consistent across the size of a team, the industry we're in, kind of even in where in the world we are.
Geography, it's pretty relevant. It's pretty much stable. Your findings we can take these anywhere.
Yeah.
And they're consistent.
Yeah, that's what the data are saying to us.
Okay, fantastic. How does naming the type of conflict matter for resolving it? Is that important? Like, these 4 different categories, does that help you telling leaders, this is what you need to identify, this is what's going on here? Does it help having these different groups?
Yeah, it really helps to understand the structure is what we've found. So we asked people, our managers, right? If you found this structure versus that one, would you manage it differently? Most said yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So just they're inclined to treat it differently. And then we started looking at what kind of things actually help resolve conflict and what, for example, maybe make conflict worse or, and other things. So, for example, if the conflict is one difficult individual, mm-hmm. when it first emerges, it looks dyadic because I'm disagreeing with you, mm-hmm. right? And if you watch over time, what happens is I'm disagreeing with you and you and you out there. And then you're like, okay, no, the problem is this person.
Sure.
Now, what sometimes happens is your managers don't want to call someone out. Mm-hmm. So then they might try on having a big kind of retreat. Everybody comes and we can discuss conflict within the team. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we all kind of know, apparently except for the one person, that it's really just that one person.
Sure.
Right? It's a application of a conflict resolution strategy that if you have a much bigger conflict, like a half and half kind of thing, mm-hmm. right? That, bringing everybody together, having that conversation is quite useful.
Okay. So if it's one person, is it ever though that the manager, the leader doesn't recognize that right away and everyone else does, or is that's usually not?
No, that's also the case too.
Okay.
So one of the studies I'm kind of best known for is surveying all the top teams of the hotel companies, big hotel companies around the world.
Okay.
And we asked them within their team, how much trust is there within your team? What was fascinating about that was everybody agrees except the CEO. The CEO's evaluation of level of trust within the team is unrelated completely to the actual level that everybody else agrees is going on within the team. And I've since replicated that in other places as well.
Okay.
Here's the problem. If you're a team leader, mm-hmm. you have a good dyadic relationship with several people, with the team members, and you think, okay, well, that must reflect how the team works. Mm-hmm. No. Right? There are all kinds of things, dynamics can be happening around that in your dyadic interactions you don't see. Okay.
So the CEO, in a sense, are they too far removed from it sometimes? Or is that, my thinking is not right here?
It's a great question. And I think the point is that that when you're in a leadership role, whether it's a top management team or any kind of a team, really, we think managing all the dyadically managing all the individuals is managing the team, and it is not. Managing the team is taking an interest in how are they getting along with each other, completely outside of how they get along with me.
Okay.
And that's where a lot of managers mistake dyadic interaction for team management, and it is not.
Really interesting. Okay. I did not know that. How do leaders typically misread or mismanage these different types? I mean, you've seen this a lot, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. We see it all the time, right? That, they either misunderstand the structure, like the one we talked about already, where you take the whole team away for a retreat when it's really one individual, right?
So that's a waste of time.
That's a kind of waste of time. And a dyadic discussion, right, the way to resolve that is for people to try to mediate, right, and to try to figure out what is right for the group. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, again, it's easy to, lose focus. And sometimes what started off as dyadic can even turn into this half kind of against that half, right, kind of stuff. And that it turns into, I want to win. Mm-hmm. I want my view, the view that I support, to prevail, right? Instead of saying, what is best for the group? My idea or your idea?
Okay.
My idea or your idea, what's good for the group, is likely to get a good outcome. Mm-hmm. I want to win and you have a different idea and you want to win, is highly related to having a really bad outcome.
It sounds very unsuccessful. And it sounds a bit, maybe too many egos involved, and that's a separate conversation. But certain personalities just are naturally more difficult, and if they're not managed in a certain way, which I was going to ask you, why do dyadic two-person conflicts often drag on for so long without resolution? I think you mentioned that in your research. And
actually, they're not necessarily bad. That's the thing.
Right. Some of this is good, right?
What we find is exactly that. A dyadic conversation with other people unaligned, trying to sort out what works for the group, usually results in positive outcomes for the team. This is where we have theorized this for 50 years, and we're finally now understanding why task conflict, right, that's principled, that sticks to what's good for the group, is good for your team.
And can you give me a bullet point of how is that? Why is that? Does it spur you on to work harder? Does it make a team member think differently? Does it make them more empathetic? How does that work? What is the science behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, usually a mediator or somebody who's unaligned will try to sort out. Okay, so you want this, and the other person wants that. First of all, is the problem that you're trying to solve the same problem or a different problem? Right? Or maybe you're trading off the trade-offs a little bit differently, right? And I've got to figure that out in order to figure out which idea is truly best for the group.
Okay.
But it's easier to do when you're not aligned and you're not committed to this is my idea, right? So it's hard to sometimes to see it yourself and realize that the other person actually has an important point, right? And maybe the solution is a hybrid of the two, right? But that's where you need that kind of unaligned third party to say, and then this is what our research is showing. If you don't have a mediator and a dyadic conversation, right, it doesn't result in these great outcomes. You need somebody to try to mediate, get to the bottom of all this. When you've got that, you tend to get much better outcomes.
When is mediation effective? You sort of answered that already. And when is it just performative?
Yeah. So mediation's a bad idea if you've got the two factions. By the way.
Oh, right.
Because then it's like mediating, you kind of like, we want this and you want that. It kind of turns into a negotiation for who gets what for their idea. And we've lost track of what's good for the whole group. As opposed to, that's good for your group, subgroup. This is good for my subgroup.
Okay.
Right? Which may or may not have anything to do with what works for the whole group. Us as a whole. And it's also behind why, you asked about these kind of, earlier too about the kind of interaction and basically what I show and what our research shows is that consistent, with some bigger ideas is that when groups get into that winning idea and they resort to things like voting, that results in poor outcomes for the team.
Really?
Right. Yeah.
And why is that?
Why is that? So, well, it's sometimes people say, "Oh my God!" But we vote, right? In our political life, does that mean does it automatically mean it's kind of bad? Yes and no. What democratic theory says is beware of the majority's desire to impose itself on the minority. Because if that minority has nothing left to fight for, that's literally when in political world they pick up a gun. And in your workplace, that's when they put everything down and say, fine, it's your idea. It's not mine. And you lose power.
Okay.
Right. Either of those are going to lose. Right. So things that this kind of majority rule voting as a way of resolving conflict is in small team in particular, a really dangerous idea.
It's one of the worst things you can do.
Yeah. And this is where I know that a great player when even if they've had to resort to a vote because this, on a board, the statutes require it, right? Does the chair, right, or the leader, do they go party with the winners? Yay, we won, right? Or do they go commiserate with the losers? The great leaders commiserate with the losers.
Oh, interesting.
And say, okay, we don't want you to disengage. We don't, there's still something in this for you, right? Keep them connected. If you can do that, right, that keeps the group together. You don't lose power.
Sure.
Right? That's a leadership role in this situation.
And that's a skill. I mean, do you see some people have this much better than other? Some leaders naturally can do this. Is it a learned skill, or is this something that just certain personalities are more sort of cohesive? And can I guess in all your time working with teams and managers, can you spot someone that has this ability to recognize that that's what they should do? Do you see that?
Yeah. There's two pathways to leadership in most groups. One pathway is I want to do the right thing for the right reason.
Mm-hmm.
I want the group to be successful. Something needs to change, and I can make that change happen.
Sure.
The other pathway is I want to be in charge. I want to be a leader. I like to tell other people what to do. It's a bit more power centric.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the plus is I will do whatever is necessary to acquire power, which sometimes means making decisions that need to get made. Right. It can be a positive. But then when we reward that person with leadership, we select them, they tend to stay on too long. They tend to, again, because it's about them, not the group. Mm-hmm. Right. They tend to start leading the group as though, it's all about them. So when we get to that point, I mean, that's really at the end what I see here. Is this the kind of person who's like really ultimately interested in what's good for the group, right? They want to do the right thing for the right reason. They're probably going to go commiserate with the loser.
I see.
Right.
I see.
These people, if it's about power, I need to party with the winners to keep them on side, right? To stay in power.
Okay. Yeah, it's fascinating. Let's talk about what you call warring factions, and the whole team conflict. This sounds pretty intense. Why do factional splits feel so intractable, and why? Well, you said voting won't fix it, but how can leaders break deadlock and create movement when sides are evenly split?
Yeah, so when we're evenly split, it feels kind of hopeless because it's, this subgroup against that subgroup, and we can't just outvote each other. That's the kind of easy way out, but it's very difficult to do that. So how are we going to actually get people to talk to each other and start to work together? So what our research is suggesting at this point is bring in a third idea, right? Something, and it can be even completely unrelated. Right. And the reason for this is that research shows that when you're exposed to a different idea, that causes you to think more divergently, right? Rather than, I need this, I want to win.
Sure.
It says, maybe there are other solutions here, right? I mean, and what research also shows is that third idea doesn't even have to be the one they ultimately accept or the correct one.
Okay.
It just needs to be a kind of like,
an alternative way of thinking.
An alternative way of thinking, yeah. And that causes all of us to rethink and loosens up that tension and allows us the possibility of starting to see, something that maybe we can all win from. Tough, but that's your best shot.
When it comes to full team blow-ups, you mentioned that a whole team conflict is rare but very toxic. How should leaders respond when everyone is pointing fingers at everyone else?
Yeah. So now
this is a small percentage, you said.
Yeah, it's a small percentage. When it does happen, you got to go to some very classic international relations conflict management kind of strategies.
Okay.
Right. And they include things like trying to find the common denominator that links all of us. Right. What do we all agree on? We all agree we want to be successful by this measure or that measure. Okay. It's a starting point. Right. And it may take us a while, but if we can use that as the glue that hold us together a bit, maybe we can come together and figure it out.
Okay.
You also have things like GRIT, which is graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I know. But the idea of gritting a pathway, for example. Sure. And that can work when you get people to start giving a little, just a little. You give a little, you give a little, you give a little. Just a little bit, that you start to get a little bit of movement towards each other. And if you can kind of build on that, you have some hope of that. I mean, these are classic strategies, been around for a long time because they are the only thing that we know works, at least some, in these really difficult, intractable, conflict situations. And at the team level, that's when most everybody has a different point of view.
Do you see this happening more? I mean, you said before, it happens across the board. Big company, small company, multinational, geographical location, it doesn't. But do you by this point, can you look over a broad array of companies and go, these are ones that are more likely to have conflict? There's not even an industry that you think you can pinpoint, or there's not a pattern anywhere. It just happens everywhere. There's no one industry that's joyfully, happily working together. Conflict does happen everywhere.
Yeah, their conflict management will differ by industry.
Okay.
For sure. If you ever had any experience in private equity, right? This is a kind of like no dressing it up, bam.
Right.
This is what I think kind of a culture.
Okay. Things happen quickly. Decisions have to be made.
Yeah. But it doesn't, but the structure ends up being surprisingly similar.
Okay.
Right. So how we manage it certainly is different by culture and industry.
Yeah.
But the kind of specifics, if you actually get to the structural level, I think it's just about being human beings, if I'm honest. I mean, that seems to be what we're finding.
Sure. So interesting. So you can't solve team conflict without understanding its shape. An effective intervention starts with accurate diagnosis. But one of the most useful things I found in your article is the idea that not all team building should be treated the same. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yes. Sometimes the focus is on, the way to get it is that taking that a big idea, what holds us together, team building, yay, rah, rah kind of stuff. I would say a couple things about that. Number one, it was very popular 20 years ago for people to go off into the woods or into the desert, right, and fall backwards. And that was supposed to build trust if I catch you.
A retreat sort of atmosphere.
Yeah, retreat kind of atmosphere. But they don't happen very much anymore. And the reason is because trust is domain specific. Trust is the gold dust of any of these teams in conflict. If you have trust, most any process is probably going to get you to a reasonable outcome. When you don't have trust is when we start to have to be very careful about how we build. So everybody wants trust, but you can't really manufacture it, right? The thing is, if you fall backwards in the woods and I catch you, that says, I trust you in the woods. Whether I trust you back in the office, completely different.
Right. So we used to think that correlated.
We used to think you could take one and move it over to the other. And it turns out that doesn't work that way.
Okay.
However, distrust is universal. So now if I drop you in the woods by accident, I now no longer trust you in the office. So most of those retreats were a kind of lose-only proposition.
Okay.
If I drop you in the woods, I'm now damaged in the office. But if I catch you in the woods, it doesn't come back with me to the office.
So what's the point?
So they all die to death, I think, in the end. They sound like a really good idea. In practice, there's a reason. If you understand trust, as we do now, you see why they didn't actually work.
So what's taken the place? I know this is probably a complicated question because we're just, trying to figure out the workplace right now still with hybrid work and post-COVID. And what do teams do now instead of, an away day or going on a trip or something? Is there anything else that takes the place of that? Or?
Well, I mean, when it comes to building trust, the best way to do it is to start off small, right, and have small disagreements you can resolve, which says to me, we can resolve disagreements. The next one's a little bit bigger and the next one's a little bit bigger. Okay. It kind of grows over time. And so instead of sweeping all those little things under the carpet, drawing attention to them, like, look, we were able to resolve that, and that. These are, they're fairly straightforward. But if we can do that, right, that's the signal we can probably handle something even more difficult.
Okay.
And I think we sometimes underappreciate this. We kind of don't talk about it enough. That's the way real trust, comes to happen.
Just having frank conversations.
And solving little problems then that turn into bigger and bigger and bigger ones.
Okay.
And it doesn't have to take forever either. We've all worked in teams where, something is right from the beginning. We all have to take, I see it in the classroom where everybody has to take a role. Right. And you see some teams where there's some big debate about, who's going to take which role, et cetera. And other teams, they're just working out quickly. Everybody, nobody's going to make a fuss. It's like, okay, that is a signal that this team is going to be able to build a degree of trust even within a relatively short window here. Enough trust to do this well. So
it's just in that respect, it was lucky that these certain individuals are all going to get along and they just move rather swiftly. But that, as we know, doesn't always happen.
Oh, it doesn't always happen. And what research shows is that, teams where everybody trusts everybody, perfect, right? But even teams where nobody trusts anybody are workable.
Okay.
Because, I don't trust you, but then I don't trust you and you don't trust me.
Right.
So it's trust but verify. on everything. And you don't feel bad I'm verifying. I don't feel bad you're verifying, because we all kind of know that's what we have to do.
Sure.
It's when I trust you and you don't return the trust.
Okay.
Now, I'm throwing it out there and you're like, you want to verify? I'm like, excuse me?
Mm-hmm.
You want to verify this? Like, I'm giving it to you in trust, right? And doing the right thing. And then you don't respond. You don't reciprocate.
Okay.
That's where teams start to struggle very quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine. What are your golden rules for knowing when to step in and how? Is there a light bulb moment when a leader or manager should say, okay, now I need to do something? Yeah.
So first figure out what type it is. So by that, I mean, is this a personal difficulty, or is this really or is this task related? Sure. Right. If it's personal, then focus on find other ways to improve the performance of the group, and then we'll be able to get along better. Okay. Right? It's that simple. It is reverse causality. And if it's task-based, then start to think about, who's involved here? Mm-hmm. What does the underlying structure look like broadly? And importantly, if not everybody's involved, there's an opportunity here for this to actually not only be okay, but good for us. Mm-hmm. Let's make sure we find a way we keep people focused on what's good for the group. Mm-hmm. And then with the ones where everybody's involved, now that's the more difficult ones, where we've got to figure out how to change the narrative of what's going on. Okay. By either adding something else or, going back to things where what do we all agree on, right? Back to what I would call back to first principles. Yeah. Then you've got to really, and you really, those bigger ones, it would be really, it can be, for some people, that seems desirable to ignore, but do not ignore. Because what research also shows is that the most conflict-averse managers, ironically, end up having the most conflict around them because they don't get in and resolve it. What my own research shows is that you need to be preemptive. Mm-hmm. Do not let this escalate, because if it really starts to ask anything, well, it's not so bad, right? But if I don't get in there early, right? Thing is, the longer it goes on, the more emotional people get, the less rational they are. So really, a good leader manager will recognize this rather quickly and not let it simmer for too long. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned before that there is such a thing as good conflict. So, it can spur people on, and make them think a little bit differently. Are there any other benefits that you found in your research from conflict? Yeah, I mean, we look at all kinds of outcomes, and particularly dyadic task-based conflict just is overwhelmingly positive, right? The thing is, if you're not having any task debate in a group, you're not working hard enough. Right. You're not getting the necessary options. There's very little in life and in work, right, that doesn't require a degree of discussion, debate, trade-offs, and so on. Anything worth talking about anyway. Sure. Right. So if you're not seeing any of it, I'd be worried about that. Mm-hmm. Am I getting this kind of task-based discussion, debate? Great. Just make sure it doesn't boil over. Okay. Right. And keep focused on what's good for the group, what's good for the group, what's good for the group. And try not to go down the I want to win road. It doesn't end well. This is going to sound, maybe this is something that you don't want to answer, but have you ever seen a situation where a manager or leader just couldn't take any of this advice that we've just talked about? And what was the outcome? Do you sometimes think they just need to leave the position because this is difficult for some people? Yeah. It's not easy to deal with conflict. It's not easy. Nobody loves it. Nobody loves it. Right? I mean, that's the thing is, that's why as I joke with my students, that's why they pay you the big bucks as a manager, is you've got to deal with this stuff. Sure. Right? And if you don't, right, it can swallow you. Yeah. Right? And get in the way. I've seen, the problem I most of the time see is the one I mentioned before, which is people who are kind of, oh, it's not so bad, ignore it, don't, let's try not to let it get in the way. It'll work itself out. Right. Or, oh my gosh, even worse, these two people are, kind of, not liking each other because they disagree all the time, whatever. And they're both decent guys. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tell them they should go out to the pub together and have a pint together. Right? Because that's why, oh my gosh. The research worst advice ever. That is the worst advice ever. Right? That will blow out badly. A little bit of dislike combined with a bit of alcohol. How can this not end badly?
Right. Especially in the UK, right? With a pub on every corner.
Well, exactly. And, again, avoid that kind of stuff and,
Right.
but try to get in there and try to get in there early. And the things I've seen go wrong are where they don't get in there early and you let it grow and grow and grow. And then people get emotional and then you're like, oh, these people are just not rational. Like, yeah, at that point, they're not rational because they are angry. We all know when you're that kind of angry, the best of us become a bit irrational.
Sure.
Right.
What happens in the first scenario when it's one person causing the conflict and that's not addressed? That can just simmer that could go on for years and years. And all of these scenarios, have you seen these go on for a very long time or?
Yeah. And where they start is where they end.
Okay.
That difficult person is not going to suddenly become not difficult. And, that's where having those conversations and this is where coaching, being a coaching manager usually comes in and say,
sure.
You start with questions about along the lines of what are you trying to achieve, right? Because sometimes people say, well, I've been overlooked and therefore they get a bit, kind of rebel-like. But, you say, okay, but what are you trying to achieve? Well, I think I deserve more respect and listening than I'm getting, right? But actually, like, if you always say, well, like, I'm always right or whatever, like, you're not going to get that. So
sure.
Why can't we talk about, you talk with them about, is there a different way to interact that will get you closer to where you want to be? Because most people don't want to be sidelined, scapegoated, be seen as the rebel, right? Most people want to be part of the group.
Sure. Most people want to have a calmer existence at work and a peaceful, to get along with everyone. And
they want to make a contribution.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So if you help them to do that, then some of those rebellious behaviors will oftentimes go away.
Okay.
I mean, I used to be the chair of a school for kids with special educational needs. And those kids can be behaviorally out of control. But you bring them into the specialist environment, they start learning, all their frustrations start to fade away, and all the behaviors melt away.
Oh, that's a wonderful example.
And, and of course, for a parent whose kid has come home angry over and over and over to then have your kid come home and say, they learned something today. Isn't that just what every parent wants?
It's the dream.
Right? That's the dream. So, a lot of bad behavior is a result of some other psychological stuff that's going on. And,
That I just recently in the BBC, they were talking about how they're trying to get people back to work. And someone made the comment, well, the workplace isn't often a nice place for some people. And that's part of the problem, right? Why would you be rushing back to work if you didn't enjoy it or you felt it was toxic or, it was, and do you see that a little bit as
Of course. Yeah. There are a couple of reasons why people don't want to always come back to work or not come to work full time. Sometimes it's cost, right?
Sure.
Sometimes it's this kind of like, I don't want to go back to a difficult workplace,
right?
Or a difficult colleague, et cetera. Conflict. And, since the pandemic, people see working from home as like a right, right? Instead of it used to be that was like the luxury they allowed you to.
Remember when getting a Friday to work from home?
Yeah,
it was a really
big deal, right? But that's now changed, and it's changing the workplace for sure. Right.
How do you see that? Because I feel like now a lot of companies are saying by next year, by 2026, they want a lot of employees back in 5 days a week. Do you think that could happen?
I certainly think it could happen. Like it's from my point of view, I'm not sure it's always the best outcome.
With everything we're talking about with conflict, is it easier to have a little bit of a hybrid? Is it easier to have a hybrid work environment if there is conflict?
If there is conflict, a hybrid environment is probably a bit easier because it's not quite in your face all the time in the same way.
A Zoom call is very different from sitting next to someone that you find difficult.
Yeah. But of course, even in a culture or a company where you're coming in only 2 or 3 days of the week, right? Do you coordinate a day when everybody's in?
Right.
Right. Which may be the day you have to do that group retreat because the group is all having this, difficult, conflict that we talk past each other when we're not all in the same room.
Okay.
But once we are, so you still have, there's a reason why companies want people to come back in, right? And, all the informal conversations that can emerge from this in a good way, right? Side conversations,
Sure.
the informal conversations. And those can they can be helpful with conflict and they can be hurtful with conflict, right? So that's why
there's pros and cons.
I'm not seeing a big plus or minus on
Okay.
conflict management with this.
Okay.
Other than obviously having to plan a little more carefully about who's in and when,
Sure.
if you need that kind of interactive part of conflict, but sometimes you do.
And one last question. Of those 4 different types of conflict we've discussed, which one is the most difficult? Is it the dyadic is the most common, but is it when they're all at each other? The 4th example, is that the most difficult?
I think the 4th example is the most difficult to manage, most difficult to deal with, and because nobody feels like they have support, right? Of other people,
Right.
They feel unsafe. Unlike the factions, right? Well, at least in each warring faction feels safe within itself.
They have psychological safety in one half of the group.
Yeah.
So,
whereas this other one, everybody's on their own, which is pretty low. And when people feel that kind of lonely,
right.
there's a lot of shutdown behavior, a lot of kind of withdrawal behavior. You see it in a group that's in a student group when they're interacting. You see it in the workplace.
Sure.
So I think that one's the one that is probably the most difficult to manage. And as I said, thankfully, it's probably the least common.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, so it's all really interesting, Randall. So conflict doesn't have to be a crisis. And with the right map, it can become a moment of growth and learning and team renewal, as you've just said. So we should look at it as an opportunity in many ways. But here's my final question, Randall. Why should organizations approach team conflict as a strategic leadership issue? And what's one action they can take this week to improve how they will handle it?
Yeah, I think they need to think of conflict as an important strategic, process. Is any important decision, right, is worth, discussion, debate. There are trade-offs associated with it. And what that debate does is it allows us to explore those trade-offs. And if I weigh that trade-off a little bit more, it might change the decision versus that one. And a good debate discussion does exactly that. So for me, the most important thing that we can do is to appreciate, those kind of debates. They're not always easy, but, research really clear that, encouraging that, as the mediator, as the unaligned party, making sure that they're focused on what's right for the whole group, not just themselves, right? If we can do that in these conversations, we're going to be rewarded with much better performance.
Fantastic. Great advice for anyone in any job, really. I mean, this all relates to every workplace, I imagine. It's not just top level, it's...
Exactly. And anybody, right, can play a role. You don't have to be the team leader to help do this. Right. I've seen colleagues of mine when we were having discussions, raise their hand and say, well, actually, what I'd really like to know more about, right, and to inquire, right, and to probe and question the parties, on either side, and really helping us understand the problem, right? That's what you're looking for.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing all of your research-based knowledge and evidence. As always, it's a lively and fun conversation with you. So thank you very much, Randall.
All right. Thank you, Katie. What a pleasure to be here.
That's it for this episode of the Why Podcast. Have you dealt with team conflict recently? What worked and what didn't? Let us know on our social channels by using the hashtag #TheWhyPodcast. And make sure you follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more insights from London Business School, head to london.edu/thewhy. The Why is part of the Second 60, London Business School's anniversary initiative celebrating 6 decades of impact and exploring what's next. Thank you for listening and joining us today for the Why Podcast.